Wake up, wake up, wake up.
From Jerusalem, Israel, this is From the Midwest to the Middle East, the podcast that explores everything new in U.S. and Israeli economy. Here's your host, Philip Stein.
Hi, and welcome to a special two-part podcast we're going to have with my friend, my colleague, one of the best-known tax lawyers in Israel, Yair Benjamini, who I've worked with and known for many, many, many years. And I think we have a couple subjects to discuss, Yair, that our listeners will really find interesting and very relevant. So part one, this is our part one of our podcast. We're going to do two of them, but I'm going to lead this one with something called What's Your Number? Now, I'm actually stealing that from a well-known podcast that I listen to, but I want to talk today about the number 10, okay? And you'll see where 10 pops up in several things we're going to discuss today. So first of all, welcome. And thanks for taking the time to do this.
Thanks a lot, Phil, for inviting me on the podcast. And it's a great pleasure to be here.
Good. So let's start with something that's been around for, I think I got the call back in, I think it passed just about this time of year in 2008. Where the Knesset passed a law exempting new Olim and returning veteran residents for 10 years from reporting, from paying tax on any income they generate outside of Israel. Now, although that 10-year exemption is still intact with regard to not paying taxes on income generated from outside of Israel, there is a big change that's coming our way, people's way, starting on January 1st, 2026, which is only a few months away now. So let's start with that and how people are going to be impacted by this change.
Yeah, so it's a very dramatic change for Olim and for what we call veteran returning residents, who are people that arrived in Israel after more than 10 years abroad. And the dramatic change is that where in the past you were not required as a Ole to report or to pay tax on your foreign source income or income from your foreign assets, their exemption from reporting is being canceled. So you will still be exempt from tax on the foreign income, but now you will be required to report the exempt income on an Israeli tax return. And as an Israeli tax lawyer, I can tell you that one of our recommendations to our clients is that any amount you put on an Israeli tax return under the exempt income bracket, the higher the amount, the higher the chance that you will be audited. And therefore, I think this is, you can say it doesn't really change the essence. You can say people will still be exempt from Israeli tax, but this change in reporting is very interesting and very dramatic. And actually, because it only applies to people who become Israeli residents after January 1st, 2026, I'm seeing a lot of people have been on the fence for the past few years. Are we going to become Israeli residents? Maybe let's defer it for a year or two. A lot of these people, come October or November this year, will arrive in Israel, kiss the ground on Ben Gurion Airport and say, that's it. I am now an Israeli resident. And I think that's something that we will see over the next few years. People are saying, I arrived in Israel in December 2025.
I know it's not either of our expertise, but it does seem to me that probably someone, unless they're well into the process of becoming Olim, it's probably too late to get it done before the end of the year. My guess is, I know there's a lot of bureaucracy, at least if you're coming from the U.S., you need to get some FBI fingerprint approval and all of that. But with regard to Israelis who are listening to this, those people we know so well, and be it Silicon Valley or whatever the route is outside Boston and in New York and different centers of high tech, Austin, Texas, who are considering this. If you want to come take advantage of this, come back before the 1st of January. Are you familiar with the procedure for getting this sort of status as Toshav Chozer Batik, returning veteran resident?
It's, as you said, outside my area of expertise. Okay. But I can tell you that in Israeli tax, really the test is not based on when you formally made Aliyah or when you formally got to Toshav Chozer. The test is a center of life test. So let's say you're right now listening to this podcast on the Beltway in Washington, D.C. in your car, and you say, wow, I want to return to Israel. There's a series of steps you can take to have an argument later on that your center of life moved to Israel before the end of 25. Of course, it's great to get a Toshav Chozer from Misrad HaKlita or do the Aliyah process, but even if you didn't do it,
okay,
it's definitely a possibility.
So that's very important. I think that's critical, in fact, for people listening right now as we getting close to the last quarter of the year. So I want to just jump a little ahead or maybe going a little behind. In other words, obviously say, I'm thinking of, let's say that new Olim or Toshav Chozer keeps their U.S. job, okay? And we know over the years that when people didn't have to report these things, they may have done an aggressive allocation saying that most of their income was earned while they were in Europe or the U.S. Israel usually challenges that and takes what's called a linear approach based on how many days you were in let's say the States and how many you were not. But Israel recently announced a new voluntary disclosure program, okay, and there may be people who feel they were too aggressive how they allocated their income before this new regime came in about reporting. Can you tell us a little about that, and if those are the type of people with those issues might be taking a look at this program?
It's interesting that the voluntary disclosure, I think it's a coincidence, but it's interesting that the voluntary disclosure program is starting in this time window when people are also looking at beginning to report their foreign sourced income.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, when you tell somebody, and I'm not blaming people who made mistakes on this, because when you tell somebody there's going to be a tax exemption for 10 years when you come to Israel, sometimes people don't listen to the rest of the sentence. They say, okay, great, I'm not paying any tax in Israel. The rest of the sentence, however, is important because the tax exemption only applies to foreign source income and income from foreign assets. And as you mentioned, the Israeli tax authorities, and we've seen this in our careers, you from your side and me from my side, so many times. Income from employment, even if your employer is a U.S. resident, or from consulting services, management fees, carried interest for partners in VC funds and hedge funds, all forms of compensation, stock options. If you are physically in Israel, the position of the Israeli tax authority is that this is, at least in part, Israeli sourced income. And a lot of people don't know that. And a lot of people believe that they are exempt from paying or reporting this income to the Israeli tax authorities. And one of the very popular, not to say popular, but one of the very often situations that we see in voluntary disclosure is people who have been here, who are really under their 10-year exemption, but they are earning amounts and actually paying tax in the U.S. because they're U.S. citizens, but they're earning amounts while they're physically in Israel and not reporting the Israeli taxes. And now, even though I'm your guest on the podcast, I have a question for you. Let's say somebody does that and now goes to the Israeli tax authority and says, I'm sorry, I now realize that for the last 9 years, I should have been paying you part of my taxation on my salary. Can he do anything in the U.S.?
So that was something I did want to raise, and I'm glad you asked that question. So normally people file their tax returns, and people may even be familiar with this provision. It's called the statute of limitations. Unless they did something fraudulent or didn't hit a significant part of their income, when they file their tax return, let's suppose someone this year filed their 2024 tax return in June 15th, 2025. So they just have to count 3 years. And if they pass June 15th, 2028, because they filed in 225, they're home free. In other words, the U.S. can't ever audit them. If they took some aggressive positions, the return is closed. So then you say, wait a second, someone comes along, or Israel comes to one of these people, and it's 5 years after they filed that tax return, or it's 6 years, and Israel actually says, you know what, we don't like the way you allocated your income, and you represent them, and they come to some hopeful compromise, and they pay some tax. And they say, but my return is closed. So there is fortunately a provision for U.S. citizens with income outside of the U.S. that when a foreign tax authority changes their return, changes their assessment, they can go back up to 10 years. Okay. So people who may be felt they were in some gray area, and with, as you say, these changes coming about, that they're going to start looking at people who came in Aliyah after 12/31/25, or that they may get more aggressive in terms of people who go in and out of the states a lot. Israel a lot, they can avoid double taxation. In other words, they may have to pay more tax because Israel's stepping in, but at least the U.S. will give a credit. So it does actually go well with it if they are considering going into this voluntary disclosure program. They're not going to pay double tax. But again, I just want to, without going into too much detail, is there eligibility for this program? Can anyone go in? I know if you're already being audited, or they know if you're under investigation, people like that, you're not eligible. But is there any other type of?
Yeah, so I mean, the category of the people who can join the voluntary disclosure program, as you said, someone who's not under active audit proceedings, someone who's not under investigation. Also, they added that there's no judicial decision regarding the matter that's being audited. So if you had sued somebody outside of Israel and you've said that basically he's been holding on to your funds that you've never reported to any tax authority in the world, and then there's a judgment that was issued in your favor, you are no longer eligible for the voluntary disclosure program because the information is out in the open. But anyone else, and I have to say that the tax authorities are lenient about this. They want to have as many people join the program,
Okay,
and for the program to be successful. Anyone else can apply. The interesting thing here is that unlike previous voluntary disclosure programs, you cannot do this anonymously this time. You have to say your name right up front,
right.
which is causing people to be concerned, and it requires a lot of good faith on behalf of the taxpayer and on behalf of the tax authority, that if somebody goes in and gives them all the information, then they say, no, there's already an active investigation against you, that information will not be used. They've promised this, but you need to be in, a good faith believer to go without this being anonymously. I could just touch on like maybe two more kind of categories of people that might be interested in the voluntary disclosure. People, as we said, that have not really followed the rules of the 10-year exemption, including when they became resident. Like, I meet so many people who have been here for like 5-6 years and only believe that they became a resident after 5 or 6 years. Their 10 years could be over before they know it. And they are basically believing that their 10 years started much later than they actually started, and a lot of trust. So for this voluntary disclosure, there's a specific provision for trusts, especially if there's a trust settled by the U.S. residents, but there are Israeli beneficiaries, or there's an Israeli settler, or the settler and his wife have passed away, or her husband. Trust might be in a situation where it's already required to report in Israel and not doing that. And this is a golden opportunity for these trusts
I agree.
to come in, pay the taxes.
There's so much ignorance with regard to the trust area, also among Israeli accountants. I think it's not just the beneficiary. So I think that's for people. If anything else, if you're a beneficiary of a U.S. trust, or anybody else listening, this is a great opportunity. We have a few minutes left, and I know that, I've been here a long time, and over the years, the Israeli tax authorities sometimes throw out outrageous things, and people get all nervous, and there's articles written, and then nothing really happens. But there was something that went like a position paper, I think a few months ago, about residency. And I think as you know, a lot of people who are maybe something, on the borderline, whether they're residents or not, they sort of have tattooed into their arms, 182 days. And if I stay out 182 days, I have nothing to worry about. But Israel seems to be really lowering the bar. I know a few years ago they were talking about if your family lives here, it doesn't matter what you say, you're a resident. I don't think that was ever legislated. Where do things stand? Is it something people should just assume it's another trial balloon by Mas הכנסה or?
Well, I think that, 4 or 5 years ago, you held a conference called The Perfect Storm.
Right.
And what you're mentioning now, this new bill that's proposing to, I think, really make it difficult for people to argue that they're not residents of Israel, taken together with this January 1st, 2026 change, is something that is bringing a lot of people to try and become a resident this year because they understand that from next year, it's going to be very difficult. I have a client whose wife and children are here in Israel, but he's really living in the US. He maybe spends 110 days a year in Israel, and his center of life is in the US. His work is in the US. His companies are in the US. And he's been successful so far in staying under 183 days a year and under 425 in a consecutive 3-year period by spending like 100, 110 days. We've calculated for this client that if the new law passes, if he spends more than 75 days a year in Israel, he will be regarded a resident without an ability to appeal. So it's not like you can go and argue and say, no, I'm just spending it here for my sick brother, God forbid, or I'm doing it for charity, or I'm just spending the summers here. This is unappealable determination of residence. And we still don't know if the law is going to pass. As you said, they float these balloons up in the air once in a while, and there was an outcry because this really was very, very strict change or proposed change in the law. And I haven't seen, the actual legislation hit the Knesset finance committee's, sessions yet. I don't know how long the Knesset is going to be around to legislate this. At the end of the day, if this passes, I think we'll see a lot of people being stuck in double residency situations, and they'll need to appeal to both the IRS from one side and Israeli tax authority to say, I can't be a resident in 2 countries at once. So why don't the 2 of you decide where I'm resident, which that's very costly, long process that's painful for people.
No, very draconian proposal. Okay, so I think for me, our time for part 1 of our series is up. We're going to come back. Anyone who's listening wants to hear to part 2. We're really going to talk then about, mostly Yair will be talking about changes that actually went into effect for 2025 in terms of Israel tax legislation. It's not something that's coming. It's something we should already be living with, and people should be aware of these changes. So Yair, thank you. Stick around. We're going to hook up soon. And thanks for taking the time today. Really raised some very interesting issues around topics that really can affect a lot of people. So thanks.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot.
I hope you enjoyed our podcast. Feel free to visit us at www.pstein.com or look for Philip Stein & Associates on Facebook and LinkedIn.